The morning air was sharp and cold as Helen walked slowly toward the old courthouse steps. Her hands rested on her round belly, feeling the baby move restlessly inside. 7 months pregnant and alone in the world. That's how she felt as she looked at the crowd gathering for the county auction. Helen had never been to one of these auctions before. She never thought she'd need to. Just 6 months ago, she and her husband David had been planning for their first baby, talking about names and painting the nursery yellow since they wanted to be surprised. Now David was gone, taken by a sudden heart attack at just 28 years old, and Helen was drowning in medical bills and debt. The doctor bills were the worst part. David had been in the hospital for 3 weeks before he passed, and every day had cost them more money than Helen made in a month working at the local diner. Their small savings account was empty. The bank was threatening to take their little farmhouse. And here she was, 7 months pregnant, trying to figure out how to survive. She had heard about the county auctions from her neighbor, Mrs. Peterson. Sometimes you can find good deals there, the older woman had said while bringing Helen another casserole. People sell all kinds of things when they're in trouble. Helen hadn't planned to buy anything. She barely had $20 to her name. But she was curious, and frankly, she had nowhere else to go on this cold October morning. The auctioneer was already setting up his podium when Helen arrived. He was a thin man with a loud voice and quick hands, the kind of person who could make you buy something you didn't need before you realized what happened. Around him, people were examining items laid out on tables: old furniture, farming tools, kitchen equipment, and various household goods. Helen recognized the look in many of their eyes. These were people like her, folks who had fallen on hard times and needed to sell whatever they could to pay their debts. But then Helen noticed something that made her stomach turn. In a separate area, away from the furniture and tools, stood 2 people who clearly weren't there to sell things. They were there to be sold. A man and a young boy stood together, both looking tired and defeated. The man appeared to be in his early 30s, tall and broad-shouldered but clearly beaten down by life. His clothes were dirty and torn in several places. His face showed fresh bruises, and he had a cut on his lip that looked recent. Despite his rough appearance, he kept one protective arm around the boy beside him. The child couldn't have been more than 8 or 9 years old. He was painfully thin, with clothes that were too big for his small frame. His dark hair needed cutting, and his shoes had holes that he tried to hide by keeping his feet close together. But it was his eyes that broke Helen's heart. They held a fear and sadness that no child should ever have to carry. Helen had heard about this practice but had never seen it herself. During the Great Depression, and even now in the early 1950s, when people couldn't pay their debts, sometimes they had to sign work contracts that were essentially sold to pay what they owed. It was legal, but it felt wrong to Helen. These were human beings, not cattle. She moved closer to hear what the auctioneer was saying about them. The man's name was Robert, and the boy was his son Jimmy. Robert had been a coal miner until an accident injured his back and left him unable to work for several months. During that time, his wife had gotten sick with pneumonia. Without money for proper medical care, she had died, leaving Robert and Jimmy with nothing but debt. They had been staying in a boarding house, but when Robert couldn't pay the rent, the landlord had taken them to court. The judge had ruled that Robert and Jimmy would work off their debt through contracted labor. Whoever bought their contract would essentially own their time and labor for the next 2 years. Helen listened as people in the crowd discussed what they might do with cheap labor. Some talked about needing help with farm work. Others mentioned having someone to do cleaning and maintenance. A few made jokes that made Helen's cheeks burn with anger. These people were talking about Robert and Jimmy like they were things to be bought and used, not human beings with feelings and dignity. As the auction progressed through various household items, Helen found herself unable to look away from Robert and Jimmy. The boy kept glancing around nervously, while Robert stood straight despite his obvious pain and exhaustion. There was something in the man's posture that spoke of pride not yet broken, of a father determined to protect his son no matter what. Finally, the auctioneer called for attention. "Now we come to lot number 47, he announced loudly. The work contracts for Robert Miller and his son James. 2 years of labor to satisfy their outstanding debts. We'll start the bidding at $25. Helen felt sick as hands went up around the crowd. The bidding moved quickly. $30, $40, $50. She heard comments from the bidders that made her want to cry. One man joked about getting 2 workers for the price of one. Another talked about how useful it would be to have someone who couldn't quit or ask for more. Money. Robert's jaw was tight as he listened to people bid on his and his son's lives. Jimmy pressed closer to his father, and Helen could see the boy was trying not to cry. The humiliation and fear in both their faces was more than Helen could bear. Without really thinking about what she was doing, Helen found herself raising her hand. $60, she called out in a voice that sounded braver than she felt. The crowd turned to look at her, and she could feel their curious stares. A pregnant woman alone bidding on work contracts? It didn't make sense to them, and honestly, it didn't make much sense to Helen either. She had $63 to her name, money she had planned to use for baby supplies and food for the next few weeks. $60 from the lady in the blue coat, the auctioneer called. Do I hear 65? There was a moment of silence. Helen held her breath, suddenly terrified that someone would outbid her. What would she do then? She didn't have more money to offer, but as the seconds passed, no other hands went up. Maybe $60 was more than most people wanted to spend on workers they'd have to feed and house. Maybe they sensed something in Helen's desperate bid that made them step back. $60 going once, the auctioneer called. Going twice. His gavel came down with a sharp crack. Sold to the lady in blue for $60. Helen's legs felt weak as the reality hit her. She had just spent almost all her money on the work contracts of 2 strangers. She was pregnant, alone, and nearly broke, and now she was responsible for a grown man and a child. What had she done? But as she walked forward to complete the paperwork and payment, she caught Robert's eye. Instead of the defeated look she expected, she saw something else. Confusion, maybe even a tiny spark of hope. Jimmy was still pressed against his father's side, but he was watching Helen with curious eyes. The legal paperwork was simple but formal. Helen signed documents stating that she was now responsible for Robert and Jimmy Miller for the next 2 years. They would work for her to pay off their debts, and she would provide them with food, shelter, and basic necessities. It felt strange and wrong to sign papers that gave her legal control over other people's lives, even temporarily. As Helen handed over her $60, almost every penny she had left in the world, she wondered what David would have thought of this decision. He had always been the practical one in their marriage, the one who carefully counted every dollar and planned for the future. Would he have understood why she couldn't let Robert and Jimmy be bought by someone who might treat them badly? The crowd was beginning to disperse as Helen approached Robert and Jimmy. Up close, she could see that Robert's injuries were even worse than she had first thought. Someone had clearly beaten him recently, and his left hand was wrapped in dirty bandages. Jimmy's clothes were cleaner than his father's, suggesting that Robert had been trying to take care of his son even when he couldn't take care of himself. "I'm Helen," she said quietly, looking between the man and boy. I guess you'll be coming home with me." Robert studied her face carefully. He had learned not to trust easily, especially after everything that had happened to his family. "Ma'am," he said formally, his voice rough from exhaustion. "We appreciate what you did back there. We'll work hard for you, I promise. Jimmy's a good boy, and he can help with chores around your place." Helen looked down at Jimmy, who was still clinging to his father's side. The boy looked up at her with those sad, wary eyes, and Helen felt her heart break a little more. "How old are you, Jimmy?" she asked gently. 8, the boy whispered, his voice so quiet Helen had to lean down to hear him. "Are you hungry?" Helen asked, and immediately saw both father and son try not to react too eagerly. When had they last had a real meal? "We're fine, ma'am," Robert said quickly, but Helen could hear his stomach growling from where she stood. Helen made a decision that felt both terrifying and absolutely right. "Well, I'm very hungry," she said, one hand resting on her pregnant belly. "And I think we should all get some lunch before we head to my place. There's a diner just down the street that makes excellent soup." For the first time since she had noticed them, Helen saw Jimmy's face brighten slightly. Robert looked uncertain, as if kindness was something he couldn't quite trust anymore, but he nodded slowly. As they walked together toward the diner, Helen wondered why. The ride back to Helen's farm was quiet except for the sound of wagon wheels on the dirt road. Robert sat stiffly beside her on the driver's bench, while Jimmy huddled in the back with the few belongings they had managed to keep in a small cloth bag containing their only change of clothes and a worn wooden toy horse that had belonged to Jimmy's mother. Helen stole glances at Robert as they traveled the winding country road. His jaw was set tight, and she could see the muscles in his shoulders were tense despite his obvious exhaustion. She wondered what he was thinking, what he expected from her. In her rush to save them from potentially cruel treatment, she hadn't really thought about what would come next. The farmhouse came into view as they rounded the last bend. It wasn't much to look at. A small wooden house with a sagging front porch and paint that needed touching up. The barn behind it leaned slightly to one side, and the vegetable garden was overgrown with weeds. Helen felt embarrassed seeing it through strangers' eyes. She and David had always planned to fix things up when they had more money, but that time had never come. "This is it," Helen said quietly as she pulled the wagon to a stop near the front porch. "It's not fancy, but it's warm and dry." Robert helped her down from the wagon seat, his touch gentle despite the calluses on his hands. Jimmy jumped down on his own, looking around with curious eyes. The boy had been mostly silent during their meal at the diner, but Helen had noticed how he had eaten every bite of his soup and bread. Trying not to appear too eager, "Jimmy," Robert said softly, "help Mrs." He paused, realizing he didn't know Helen's last name. "Helen is fine," she said quickly. "Just Helen. And you can help me by not treating this like you're my servants. I know what the papers say, but I don't want things to be that way." Robert frowned, confusion clear on his weathered face. "Ma'am, I don't understand. You bought our contracts. We owe you 2 years of work." Helen sighed as she unlocked the front door. How could she explain that she had acted on pure emotion? That she had no real plan for how this would work? "Come inside first," she said. "We can figure out the details once you're settled." The inside of the house was modest but clean. A small living room with a stone fireplace opened into a kitchen with a wooden table and 4 chairs. Helen had always loved this kitchen. It got morning sunlight through the window over the sink, and David had installed shelves along one wall where she kept her dishes and the few books they owned. "There are 2 bedrooms upstairs," Helen explained, leading them through the house. "The smaller one has been, well, we were going to use it for the baby." Her voice caught slightly. She and David had spent so many evenings in that room, painting the walls and talking about their future child. "You can have the bigger bedroom," she continued, pushing away the sad memories. "There's a bed that should be big enough for both of you." Robert stopped walking. "Mrs. Helen, we can't take your bedroom. Jimmy and I can sleep in the barn or make a place in the kitchen." "We don't need much." "You'll sleep in the bedroom," Helen said firmly. "I won't have a child sleeping in a barn when there's a perfectly good bed in the house." She looked down at Jimmy, who was staying close to his father's side. "Jimmy, are you tired? You can rest if you want, or you can explore a little if you'd like." The boy looked up at his father for permission before speaking. "Can I see outside?" he asked quietly. "Maybe look at the animals?" Helen smiled, the first real smile she had felt in weeks. "We don't have many animals right now. Just 2 chickens and an old cow named Bessie, but you're welcome to look around." As Jimmy headed toward the back door, Robert caught his arm gently. "Stay close to the house," he warned. "And don't touch anything without asking first." Helen watched this interaction with interest. Despite everything they had been through, Robert was still being a careful, protective father. There was something about the way he spoke to Jimmy, firm but loving, that reminded her of how David had talked about their future children. Once Jimmy was outside, Robert turned to Helen with a serious expression. "Ma'am, I need to understand what you expect from us. I've worked for people before who seemed kind at first, and I learned that there's always a price. What do you want us to do? What are the rules?" His directness caught Helen off guard. She had been so focused on getting them away from the auction that she hadn't really thought about practical matters. I suppose I need help with the farm work," she said slowly. "The garden needs attention, and there are repairs that need doing around the place. I'm not going to be able to do much physical work as the baby gets bigger." Robert nodded. "I can do that. My back's still healing from my mining accident, but I can handle most farm work. Jimmy's young, but he's good with animals and he can help with lighter chores." "What about food and supplies?" Helen asked, suddenly realizing another problem. "I spent most of my money today buying your contracts. I'm not sure how I'm going to feed all of us." For the first time since she had met him, Robert's expression softened slightly. "I know how to hunt and I'm good with vegetable gardens. If you've got seeds or can get some, I can make that garden productive again. Jimmy and I were used to making do with very little." Helen felt a wave of relief. Maybe this wouldn't be the disaster she was starting to fear. "There's a root cellar behind the house with some preserved food from last year," she said. "And I have a small amount of money left. If we're careful, we might be able to make it work." They were interrupted by Jimmy's excited voice calling from outside. "Papa, come see!" Robert and Helen both hurried to the back door, where they found Jimmy crouched next to a small flower garden that Helen had planted in the spring. Most of the flowers had died with the first frost, but a few hardy chrysanthemums were still blooming in bright yellow and orange. "Look, Papa," Jimmy said, his voice full of wonder. "The flowers are still growing even though it's cold." Robert knelt beside his son, and Helen was surprised to see his expression become gentle. "Those are chrysanthemums, Jimmy. Your mama used to grow those. Remember?" Jimmy nodded seriously. "She said they were brave flowers because they bloomed when other flowers gave up." Helen felt tears sting her eyes. This was the first time either of them had mentioned Jimmy's mother, and the pain in Robert's voice was unmistakable. "Would you like to help me take care of them?" Helen asked softly. "I planted them this spring, but I haven't been able to tend them much lately." Jimmy looked up at her with those serious dark eyes. "Could I really help?" "I helped Mama with her flowers before she got sick." "Of course you can help," Helen said. "In fact, I could use a garden assistant. Do you know much about vegetables too?" "A little," Jimmy said, standing up and brushing dirt off his knees. "Papa taught me about corn and beans and potatoes." As they talked about gardening, Helen noticed that some of the tension was leaving Robert's shoulders. He was watching his son with obvious love, and she could see how much it meant to him to see Jimmy showing interest in something positive. That evening, Helen prepared a simple dinner with what she had in the house: potatoes, carrots from her garden, and some preserved meat. As they sat around the kitchen table, she was struck by how strange and yet somehow right it felt to have other people in her house again. "This is very good. Mrs. Helen," Jimmy said politely after taking a bite of the stew she had made. "Just Helen," she corrected gently, "and thank you. I'm glad you like it." Robert ate quietly, but Helen noticed he finished everything on his plate. When was the last time he had eaten a home-cooked meal? When was the last time either of them had sat at a real table with proper dishes? After dinner, Helen showed them to their room upstairs. The bedroom was simple but comfortable, with a double bed, a small dresser, and a window that looked out over the backyard. She had put fresh sheets on the bed and left towels on the dresser. "There's a wash basin and pitcher there," she said, pointing to a corner of the room. "I heat water on the stove if you want to wash up. And there's an outhouse behind the barn." Robert looked around the room with an expression Helen couldn't quite read. "This is more than we've had in a long time," he said quietly. "Thank you." Helen started to leave, then turned back. "Robert, can I ask you something?" He nodded, settling Jimmy on the bed and helping the boy take off his worn shoes. "At the auction, you looked like you wanted to fight back, like you were angry about what was happening, but you didn't cause trouble. Why?" Robert was quiet for a moment, smoothing Jimmy's hair back from his face. "Because I learned that fighting back just makes things worse for Jimmy," he said finally. "I spent some time being angry after my wife died, getting into fights with people who treated us badly. All it did was get me beaten up and make things harder for my son. Jimmy's safety is more important than my pride." Helen felt a lump form in her throat. Here was a man who had swallowed his dignity and endured humiliation to protect his child. "You're a good father," she said softly. Robert looked up at her with surprise, as if kindness was something he had forgotten existed. "I try to be," he said. "Jimmy's all I have left of his mother. I won't let anything happen to him." As Helen went back downstairs to clean up the kitchen, she found herself thinking about the strange turn her life had taken. This morning she had been alone and desperate, facing the prospect of losing her home and raising her baby with no support. The first few weeks were harder than any of them had expected. Helen woke up each morning unsure of how to navigate this strange new arrangement. Robert seemed determined to prove his worth through backbreaking work, often pushing himself until Helen could see him wincing with pain from his injured back. Jimmy followed his father around like a shadow, eager to help but clearly still fearful that this new stability might disappear at any moment. The November weather turned cold quickly, and Helen realized how much work the little farm actually needed. The roof leaked in 3 places, letting rain drip into buckets she had to empty twice a day. The barn door hung crooked on its hinges, and the fence around the chicken coop had several broken posts that let the chickens wander wherever they pleased. Robert attacked these problems with a fierce, Determination that both impressed and worried Helen. Despite his injured back, he climbed onto the roof to patch the leaks, using whatever materials he could find around the property. When Helen tried to tell him to be careful, he would give her a look that was both grateful and stubborn. "I need to earn my keep," he told her one morning when she found him trying to straighten the barn door despite obvious pain. "You took a big risk buying our contracts, and I won't have you regretting it." Helen wanted to tell him that she already didn't regret it, but she could see that Robert needed to feel useful. After losing his job, his wife, and his independence, work was how he was trying to rebuild his sense of worth. Jimmy, meanwhile, was slowly coming out of his shell. The boy had a natural way with the animals that amazed Helen. Bessie the cow, who had always been skittish and hard to milk, seemed to calm down completely when Jimmy was around. The chickens, who normally scattered when anyone approached, would actually come to Jimmy when he called them. "He's got a gift," Robert said one evening as they watched Jimmy gently coax a hen back into the coop. His mother was the same way. Animals just trusted her. It was one of the few times Robert had mentioned his wife without his voice becoming tight with pain. Helen was learning that both father and son carried their grief quietly, but it was always there, just beneath the surface. The subject of Jimmy's schooling came up during their second week together. Helen had noticed that the boy could read a little, but his writing was shaky and his arithmetic needed work. "He hasn't been to school much this past year," Robert admitted when Helen brought it up. "After his mother died and I lost my job, we moved around too much. I tried to teach him what I could, but..." He shrugged helplessly. Helen made a decision that she knew would cause talk in town. "The school is only 2 miles down the road," she said. "Jimmy should be going." Robert's face tightened. "People in town know what happened at the auction. They know that we're working for you because of our debts. Jimmy might not be welcome." "Then we'll make sure he is welcome," Helen said firmly. The protective tone in her voice surprised even her. When had she become so fierce about this boy's welfare? The next Monday, Helen walked Jimmy to school herself. Her pregnant belly made the 2-mile walk challenging, but she was determined to face any problems head-on. The schoolhouse was a small white building with one room for all the grades taught by Miss Catherine, a woman in her 50s who had been teaching local children for over 20 years. Miss Catherine looked surprised when Helen arrived with Jimmy, but she listened politely as Helen explained the situation. "Jimmy needs to be in school," Helen said simply. "He's a bright boy who deserves an education." "And you're willing to take responsibility for him?" Miss Catherine asked, looking between Helen and Jimmy, who was staying close to Helen's side. "I am," Helen said without hesitation. Miss Catherine studied Jimmy for a moment, taking in his clean but worn clothes and serious expression. "Can you read, Jimmy?" she asked kindly. Jimmy nodded and quietly read a few sentences from a primer she handed him. His reading was slow but accurate, and Miss Catherine smiled. "Well then, I think we can find a place for you here. You'll be in the group with the other 8- and 9-year-olds. As Helen prepared to leave, she heard one of the older children whisper something about the auction boy. Jimmy's shoulders tensed, and Helen felt a surge of protective anger, but before she could say anything, Miss Catherine spoke up. "Class," the teacher said firmly, "we have a new student today. Jimmy will be joining us, and I expect everyone to make him feel welcome. We don't repeat gossip in this classroom, and we treat each other with kindness. Is that understood?" The children nodded, and Helen felt a wave of gratitude toward the stern but fair teacher. Jimmy's first few days at school were difficult. He came home quiet and withdrawn, and Helen could tell that some of the children were not being kind. But gradually things began to improve. Jimmy was naturally smart, and once he began to catch up with his lessons, other children started to see him as more than just the auction boy. Helen made it a point to help Jimmy with his homework every evening after dinner. They would sit at the kitchen table while Robert worked on farm repairs, and Helen would guide Jimmy through his arithmetic problems and reading assignments. These quiet evening hours became precious to all of them, a time when the house felt truly peaceful. Robert proved to be more skilled than Helen had expected. Not only could he fix the obvious problems around the farm, but he had ideas for improvements that showed real intelligence and planning. He suggested rearranging the chicken coop to make egg collection easier. He knew which vegetables would grow well in their soil and climate. He even had ideas for making the farm more profitable. "We could expand the vegetable garden next spring," he told Helen one evening as they planned for the winter months ahead. If we grow more than we need, you could sell the extra at the market in town. And maybe we could get a few more chickens. Eggs sell well, especially from free-range hens. Helen was impressed by his knowledge and his forward thinking. Where did you learn so much about farming? She asked. I grew up on a farm before I went into the mines, Robert explained. My father always said mining was good money, but farming was good living. I should have listened to him. As November turned into December, Helen began to notice changes in both Robert and Jimmy that went beyond their growing comfort with farm life. Robert was standing straighter, speaking more confidently. The hunted look that had been in his eyes at the auction was fading, replaced by something that looked like hope. Jimmy was laughing more, asking questions, even playing sometimes instead of just working. But the biggest change was in how the three of them interacted with each other. What had started as a formal arrangement was slowly becoming something that felt like family. Helen's pregnancy was progressing, and she found herself relying more on Robert for help with physical tasks. He seemed to anticipate her needs, appearing with a glass of water when she looked tired, or taking over cooking duties when she felt too nauseous to stand at the stove. You don't have to take care of me, Helen told him one morning when she found him preparing breakfast because she had been sick during the night. I know I don't have to, Robert said quietly, not looking up from the eggs he was scrambling. I want to. There was something in his tone that made Helen's heart skip a beat. Was she imagining the tenderness she thought she heard? Jimmy, meanwhile, had become fascinated with Helen's pregnancy. He would ask careful questions about the baby, and sometimes Helen would let him feel the baby kick. His face would light up with wonder every time. Will the baby be my little brother or sister? Jimmy asked one evening. The question caught both Helen and Robert off guard. Helen looked at Robert, unsure how to answer. They hadn't talked about what would happen after the baby was born, or what their relationship would be in the long term. The baby will be lucky to have you looking out for him or her, Robert said carefully, but Helen could see the emotion in his eyes. As winter settled in, the three of them fell into routines that felt natural and right. Robert would get up early to tend the animals and check on the farm. Helen would prepare breakfast while Jimmy did his morning chores, collecting eggs and helping with whatever small tasks his father assigned him. After breakfast, Helen would walk Jimmy to school when the weather was good, or Robert would take him when the roads were too icy for a pregnant woman to navigate safely. The evenings were Helen's favorite time. After dinner and homework were finished, they would often sit by the fire. Robert would whittle small toys for Jimmy, or repair household items that needed attention. Jimmy would practice his reading, or play quietly with the wooden animals his father carved for him. Helen would mend clothes or knit baby items, feeling peaceful in a way she hadn't experienced since David's death. Sometimes they would talk about their plans for the spring planting, or Robert would tell stories about his childhood on his family's farm. Jimmy would occasionally share memories of his mother, and Helen would tell them about David and the dreams they had shared for their farm. The people in town were beginning to take notice of the changes at Helen's place. When she went to the general store or walked Jimmy to school, neighbors would comment on how much better the farm looked. The repairs were obvious and the property had a cared-for appearance that it had lacked since David's death. But Helen also noticed the whispers and speculative looks. The first week of December brought a blizzard that would change everything for Helen, Robert, and Jimmy. It started as a light snowfall on Thursday morning, but by afternoon the wind had picked up and the snow was falling so heavily that Helen could barely see the barn from the kitchen window. This is going to be a bad one, Robert said, coming in from securing the animals with snow in his hair and worry in his eyes. I've seen storms like this before. We could be snowed in for several days. Helen felt a flutter of anxiety that had nothing to do with the weather. She was now 8.5 months pregnant, and the baby had been unusually active all day. Her back ached more than usual, and she had been having what she thought were practice pains since morning. By evening, the wind was howling around the house, and snow was piling up against the windows. Jimmy pressed his face to the glass, amazed by the wall of white outside. I can't even see the fence posts, he said in wonder. Helen tried to smile at his excitement, but another wave of pain across her lower back made her grip the edge of the kitchen table. Robert noticed immediately. Are you all right? He asked, moving to her side. I'm fine, Helen said automatically, but even as the words left her mouth, she felt a strange sensation, followed by a warm wetness running down her legs. She looked down in shock, and Robert followed her gaze. "Helen," Robert said quietly, his voice suddenly very serious. "I think your water just broke." The words hit Helen like a physical blow. "No," she said, shaking her head. "It's too early. The baby isn't supposed to come for another few weeks." But even as she spoke, another contraction hit her, stronger than the practice pain she had been having. This one was real, unmistakable, and it made her gasp and double over. Robert was already moving, his mind switching into crisis mode. "Jimmy," he called to the boy who was still looking out the window. "Come away from there. I need you to help me." Jimmy turned around and saw Helen gripping the table, her face pale with pain and fear. His eyes went wide. "Is the baby coming now?" he asked. "Yes," Robert said simply. "And we need to be ready to help." Helen felt panic rising in her chest. "Robert, we need to get to town. We need the doctor. I can't have this baby here, not like this." Robert looked toward the window where the snow was now so thick that the glass appeared solid white. "Helen, look outside. No one's going anywhere in this storm. The roads are probably already impassable and it's getting worse by the hour. But I don't know how to do this without a doctor," Helen said, tears starting to flow down her cheeks. "What if something goes wrong? What if the baby is hurt?" Robert moved to stand in front of her, placing his hands gently on her shoulders. "Listen to me," he said, his voice calm and steady despite the fear she could see in his eyes. "My wife had a difficult labor with Jimmy. I was there for all of it and I helped. I know what to do." Helen looked into his face, searching for reassurance. "Are you sure?" "I'm sure," Robert said firmly. "We're going to get through this together. All of us." Over the next few hours, Robert proved to be everything Helen needed him to be. He sent Jimmy to collect every clean sheet and towel in the house. He put large pots of water on the stove to heat. He helped Helen get settled in her bedroom, talking to her calmly as her contractions grew stronger and more frequent. Jimmy proved to be an excellent helper despite his young age. He followed his father's instructions without question, bringing whatever was needed and staying calm even when Helen cried out in pain. When Robert needed both hands to help Helen, Jimmy would hold her hand and talk to her in his sweet, serious voice. "My mama said that babies come when they're ready to meet their families," Jimmy told Helen during a brief break between contractions. "Maybe your baby just couldn't wait to meet us." Helen squeezed his small hand, amazed by the wisdom and kindness in this 8-year-old boy. "Maybe you're right," she whispered. As the night wore on, Helen's labor intensified. Robert never left her side, helping her change positions when she needed to move, holding her steady when the contractions made her dizzy, and encouraging her when she felt like she couldn't continue. "I can't do this," Helen sobbed during one particularly difficult contraction. "It hurts too much. Something must be wrong." "You can do this," Robert said firmly, wiping her face with a cool cloth. "You're the strongest woman I know. You saved me and Jimmy when you didn't even know us. You can do anything." His words gave Helen strength she didn't know she had. This man believed in her, trusted her, was willing to risk everything to help her bring her child safely into the world. Around 3 a.m, Robert announced that he could see the baby's head. "Helen, you need to push now," he said. "The baby's almost here." With Jimmy holding one hand and Robert coaching her through each push, Helen found reserves of strength she hadn't known existed. After what felt like hours but was probably only minutes, she felt a sudden release of pressure. Then she heard it, the most beautiful sound in the world. Her baby's first cry. "It's a girl," Robert said, his voice thick with emotion. "You have a daughter, Helen." Helen collapsed back against her pillows, exhausted but overwhelmed with relief and joy. Robert was gently cleaning the baby, wrapping her in a soft blanket that Jimmy had warmed by the fire. When he placed the tiny girl in Helen's arms, she looked down at her daughter's perfect little face and started crying all over again. "She's beautiful," Jimmy whispered, leaning over to get a better look at the baby. "She's so little." "She is beautiful," Robert agreed, and when Helen looked up at him, she saw tears in his eyes too. The baby was small but healthy, with a strong cry and bright, alert eyes. She had fine dark hair and tiny, perfect fingers that wrapped around Helen's finger when she offered it. "What will you name her?" Jimmy asked. Helen looked down at her daughter, then up at Robert and Jimmy, this man and boy who had helped bring her safely into the world. "Grace," she said softly. "Her name is Grace." As dawn broke and the storm finally began to calm, the four of them were together in Helen's bedroom. Grace was nursing contentedly. Jimmy was curled up in a chair near the bed, having finally fallen asleep after the long night, and Robert was sitting on the edge of the bed, watching Helen and the baby with an expression she had never seen before. "Thank you," Helen said quietly, careful not to wake Jimmy. "I couldn't have done this without you." "Yes, you could have," Robert said, "but I'm glad you didn't have to." There was something different in the way he was looking at her, something that made Helen's heart beat faster even in her exhausted state. "Robert," she began, but he shook his head. "Let me say this," he said softly. "I know what our arrangement is supposed to be. I know I'm here because you bought my contract, and I'm grateful for that. But what happened tonight, Helen, I would have done anything to keep you and the baby safe. Not because I owe you, but because—" He stopped, seeming to struggle with the words. "Because what?" Helen prompted gently. "Because I love you," Robert said simply. "I love you, and I love this little girl already, and I want to be the man who takes care of both of you. Not because of any contract or debt, but because that's what I want more than anything in the world." Helen felt tears start again. But these were different tears. "I love you too," she whispered. "I've been afraid to admit it, even to myself, but I do. You and Jimmy, you've become my family." Robert leaned over and kissed her forehead gently. "Then maybe when you're ready, we can make it official. Maybe we can be a real family." Helen looked around the room, at this man who had helped deliver her daughter, at Jimmy sleeping peacefully in the chair, at baby Grace content in her arms, and realized that they already were a real family. They had been for weeks now, maybe from the very beginning. The storm had trapped them together and forced them to depend on each other completely. In doing so, it had revealed the truth they had all been dancing around. This arrangement had stopped being about contracts and debts a long time ago. It had become about love, trust, and the bonds that form when people choose to care for each other. When the roads were finally clear enough for the doctor to make it to the farm 2 days later, he found a healthy mother and baby, and 2 males who were obviously devoted to their care. He also found something he hadn't expected, a family that had been forged not by blood or law, but by choice and love. "Everything looks perfect," the doctor told Helen after examining both her and Grace. "You did an excellent job bringing this little one into the world, and it's clear she's going to be well cared for." As Helen watched Robert show Jimmy how to hold Grace properly, supporting her head carefully while the 8-year-old gazed at the baby with wonder, she knew the doctor was right. Grace would be well cared for by all of them for the rest of her life. The crisis had passed, but it had changed everything. What had started as a desperate attempt to save 2 strangers at an auction had become something none of them could have imagined. A love story that proved families could be created by choice, not just by birth. Spring arrived early that year, and with it came changes that would affect not just Helen, Robert, and Jimmy, but the entire community around them. Baby Grace was now 4 months old, a happy, healthy infant who had brought joy and purpose to their little household in ways none of them could have predicted. Helen had recovered fully from childbirth, and watching Robert with Grace had only deepened her feelings for him. He was as gentle and attentive with the baby as he was with Jimmy, often getting up in the middle of the night to walk with her when she was fussy, singing old songs his own mother had taught him. Jimmy had embraced his role as big brother with enthusiasm that surprised everyone. He would spend hours entertaining Grace, making faces to get her to smile and helping with feeding and diaper changes. The serious, frightened boy from the auction had transformed into a confident child who laughed easily and spoke up in school. The changes in their little family had not gone unnoticed in town. People had watched through the winter months as smoke continued to rise from Helen's chimney, as her farm remained well-maintained despite the harsh weather, and as Jimmy continued to walk to school each day looking healthy and happy. When spring planting time came, Robert's skills as a farmer became obvious to everyone. He had expanded Helen's vegetable garden significantly, using techniques he had learned from his father to maximize their growing space. He had also convinced Helen to invest their small savings in more chickens and a young pig, with plans to become more self-sufficient. "People are starting to talk differently about us," Helen mentioned one evening as they sat on the front porch, watching Jimmy play with Grace while the sun set behind the trees. "What kind of talk?" Robert asked, though he had noticed the change in attitudes himself. Mrs. Peterson says folks are impressed with how well the farm is doing. And Miss Catherine told me that Jimmy is one of her best students now. She says he's caught up completely with his reading and arithmetic. Robert smiled, watching his son carefully stack wooden blocks for Grace to knock over. Jimmy's always been smart. He just needed stability and encouragement. Helen shifted Grace to her other arm and looked at Robert seriously. We need to talk about the future. Your work contract expires in the fall. What happens then? This was a conversation they had been avoiding for months. Legally, Robert and Jimmy would be free to leave in October, their debt to society paid. But none of them wanted to think about being separated. I've been thinking about that, Robert said quietly. I've been thinking about a lot of things, actually. Before Helen could ask what he meant, Jimmy came running up to the porch. Papa, look. Grace grabbed my finger and won't let go. They looked down at the baby, who indeed had a firm grip on Jimmy's small finger and was gurgling happily up at him. I think she's trying to tell you something, Robert said with a grin. Maybe she's saying she doesn't want her big brother to go anywhere. Jimmy's face became serious. I don't want to go anywhere. I like living here with Helen and Grace. This feels like home. Helen felt her heart clench. How could she bear to let them go? But she also knew she couldn't ask them to stay just because she needed them. They deserved to make their own choices about their future. That night, after Jimmy was asleep and Grace was settled in her cradle, Robert asked Helen to walk with him to the garden. The evening air was warm and sweet with the scent of the apple tree that was just beginning to bloom. Helen, Robert began, then stopped and took a deep breath. I need to ask you something and I want you to think carefully before you answer. Helen's heart started beating faster. What is it? Robert turned to face her, and in the moonlight she could see that he was nervous. Will you marry me? The words hung in the air between them, and Helen felt tears spring to her eyes. Robert, I know this whole situation started strangely, he said quickly, as if afraid she might say no before he could explain. I know we met because you bought my work contract, and I know that's not exactly romantic. But Helen, what we've built together these past months, this is real. My feelings for you are real. Jimmy loves you, and you've become a mother to him in every way that matters. And Grace, his voice softened. Grace feels like my daughter already. Helen wiped away tears that had started flowing. I love you too, Robert. I love all of you more than I ever thought possible. But are you sure this is what you want? You'll be free in a few months. You could go anywhere, start fresh. I don't want to go anywhere, Robert said firmly. I want to stay here with you. I want to be your husband and Grace's father and Jimmy's papa for the rest of my life. I want us to be a real family, legally and officially. Helen looked around at the farm that Robert had helped bring back to life, thought about the house that had become a home again with his and Jimmy's presence, and realized that this was what she wanted too. More than anything, yes, she said softly. Yes, I'll marry you. Robert swept her into his arms, spinning her around in the garden while she laughed and cried at the same time. When he set her down, he kissed her for the first time, and Helen felt like her heart might burst with happiness. They decided to wait until summer for the wedding, wanting to give the town time to adjust to the idea and to plan a celebration that would include everyone who had supported them. But word spread quickly, and the reactions were more positive than either of them had expected. Miss Catherine offered to help with the wedding arrangements. Mrs. Peterson insisted on providing flowers from her garden. Even the preacher, who had initially been skeptical about their unusual arrangement, came to visit and left convinced that theirs was a genuine love match. I've seen you two together, he told them. I've watched how you care for each other and those children. If that's not love, then I don't know what is. The only legal hurdle was Robert's work contract, but Helen's lawyer found a solution. Since Helen was the contract holder, she could release Robert from his obligations early. With the proper paperwork, he would be a free man well before their wedding date. As word of their engagement spread, something unexpected happened. Other people in the community began to look at the auction system differently. Helen and Robert's story made people think about the human cost of treating people's labor as something to be bought and sold. At the next county meeting, a proposal was made to discontinue the practice of auctioning work contracts. It passed by a large majority, with several people specifically mentioning how watching Helen and Robert's relationship develop had changed their minds about the system. It made us realize that these are people with feelings and dignity, not just cheap labor, one farmer explained to the local newspaper. If we're going to help folks who are down on their luck, we need to find better ways to do it. The wedding took place on a beautiful Saturday in June. Helen wore her mother's dress, altered to fit her by the local seamstress. Robert had bought a new suit with money he had earned doing extra work for neighbors. Jimmy served as ring bearer, proud and serious in his first real suit, while baby Grace slept peacefully in the arms of Mrs. Peterson. The ceremony was held in the church, but the entire town seemed to be there. People who had initially gossiped about their arrangement were now celebrating their love story. The reception was held on the church grounds with everyone contributing food and music. During the reception, Helen overheard a conversation that made her smile. Two women were talking about how romantic the whole story was. To think it all started at that awful auction, one said. Who would have thought something so beautiful could come from such an ugly situation? It just shows you never know how things will turn out, the other replied. Helen saving those two has turned into the best love story this town has seen in years. As the evening wound down and they prepared to head home as husband and wife, Robert pulled Helen aside. Do you ever regret it? He asked. Spending your last $60 on two strangers? Helen looked around at their wedding celebration, at Jimmy carefully carrying a sleeping Grace, at the friends and neighbors who had come to celebrate with them, and at this man who had become her partner in everything. It was the best investment I ever made, she said. I paid $60 and got a husband, a son, and a father for my daughter. Plus I got my farm saved and my heart healed. I'd say I got quite a bargain. Robert laughed and kissed her again, and Helen marveled at how much her life had changed since that cold October morning at the auction. As they drove home together, officially a family now, Jimmy piped up from the back of the wagon. Papa, does this mean you're never leaving us? Never, Robert said firmly. We're family now, officially and forever. Good, Jimmy said with satisfaction. I told the kids at school that you were the best papa in the world, and I didn't want to have to take it back. Years later, when reporters came to write about their story, they found a thriving farm, a successful family, and a community that had been changed by witnessing their love. Jimmy had grown up to become a teacher, inspired by Miss Catherine and his own experience of how education could transform a life. Grace had become a nurse, drawn to helping others heal just as her family had healed each other. Helen and Robert had taken in several other families over the years, always ready to help people who needed a second chance. Their farm had become known throughout the county as a place where people could find